They thought he was an easy target. They didn't know he was a Navy-trained expert who's taken down far more dangerous threats. The night air in Jackson, Mississippi was thick and humid, clinging to everything it touched. Caleb Reed sat on the porch of his newly purchased home, sipping a glass of iced tea as he watched the quiet street. At 48, Caleb was a man of few words, but many stories. Most people wouldn't guess by looking at him that he'd spent over 2 decades in the Navy, serving on missions so classified they didn't even have names. This house was his sanctuary, a place to finally lay down roots after years of constant movement. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, one-story place with a wide porch and a big oak tree in the yard. To Caleb, though, it was everything he'd ever wanted. Quiet, solitude, and a fresh start. The neighbors had taken notice of him, as neighbors in small towns often do. Caleb felt the weight of their eyes when he walked down the street or picked up his mail. Some gave polite nods, others offered tight-lipped smiles. A few didn't bother hiding their suspicion, their glares lingering a little too long. Caleb brushed it off. He'd faced worse things in life than cold stares. But there was something in the air that he couldn't ignore. It started small, gossip that seemed to ripple through the town like an invisible current. A man like Caleb, with his dark skin and quiet demeanor, stood out in this mostly white conservative neighborhood. He heard snippets of conversations at the hardware store or on the street corner. Words like, "doesn't belong," and "watch yourself." Caleb had learned long ago to stay focused, to tune out noise that didn't serve him. Then one evening, as Caleb sat unpacking boxes, the uneasy feeling he'd been ignoring came to life. Bailey, his old Labrador, perked up from her spot on the floor, letting out a low growl. Caleb followed her gaze to the window. A crash split the silence, followed by the crackle of fire. Caleb bolted to the door and threw it open. His heart sank as he saw the flames licking at the edge of his lawn. Someone had lit a pile of trash on fire, and the light of the blaze revealed hateful graffiti sprayed across the side of his house. The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Caleb's expression stayed steady. He stepped forward, scanning the darkness, but all he caught was the roar of a truck speeding away, its taillights disappearing into the night. Caleb stood there for a moment, silhouetted against the glow of the fire. He took a deep breath, his hands tightening into fists. But Caleb wasn't a man who folded under pressure. He'd faced enemies far more dangerous than this, and survived. Caleb stood on his porch for a long moment, staring at the flames as they devoured the pile of trash. The hateful graffiti glared back at him, bright red against the pale siding of his house. It wasn't fear he felt, not exactly. It was more of a simmering anger, the kind that stirred deep in his chest, measured and controlled. He grabbed the garden hose and quickly doused the fire, the smoke rising in thick clouds that stung his eyes. Bailey stayed close, growling softly at the shadows beyond the edge of the yard. Caleb scanned the street, looking for movement, for any sign of who had done this. But the neighborhood was quiet, almost unnaturally so. After ensuring the fire was out, Caleb stepped back, hands on his hips, and assessed the damage. The words sprayed on the house were crude and cruel, meant to intimidate him, to make him feel like an outsider. He didn't call the police. Caleb had dealt with enough systems in his life to know how this would go. At best, they'd take a report, slap some forms together, and call it a night. At worst, they'd chalk it up to a harmless prank. Either way, the message would be clear. You're on your own. But Caleb wasn't the kind of man to rely on others when things got tough. He spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess. By the time the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, the graffiti was scrubbed off, and the charred remains of the fire were bagged up. The house wasn't perfect again, but Caleb had done what he could. He leaned against the porch railing, sipping a fresh cup of coffee as the world around him woke up. Neighbors passed by on their way to work or school, casting quick glances in his direction. Caleb saw the flicker of guilt in some of their eyes, the way they looked at the ground or hurried their pace. They knew what had happened. That evening, Caleb decided to take a walk through town. He wasn't interested in hiding or keeping a low profile. His presence was his defiance, a silent statement that he wouldn't be pushed out of the home he'd earned. As he walked past the diner, the conversation inside hushed. At the gas station, a group of young men loitering outside fell silent, their smirks making it clear they thought this was funny. Caleb met their eyes, unflinching, until they turned away. He didn't need words to let them know he wasn't afraid. By the time he got back home, the sun had set, and the streets were quiet again. Caleb sat on his porch, the old rocking chair creaking under him. Bailey lay at his feet, her tail wagging lazily. For a moment it felt like any other evening. But just as Caleb was about to head inside, a noise cut through the night, a loud bang, followed by laughter and the screech of tires. He rushed to the end of the driveway and saw his mailbox lying in the middle of the road, smashed to pieces. Caleb stared at it, the anger from the previous night rising again. This wasn't just a one-off incident. These people wanted him to leave, to feel unsafe in the place he called home. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Caleb wasn't just any man. He was a trained fighter, a strategist, and someone who never walked away from a fight. The smashed mailbox lay in the middle of the road like a declaration of war. Caleb stood at the edge of his driveway, the sound of the gang's laughter still ringing in his ears. He knelt down, examining the pieces of twisted metal. His fingers traced the jagged edges as he thought back to his days in the Navy. Moments where split-second decisions determined survival. He had learned to read a situation, to assess threats, and to stay one step ahead. And right now, he knew exactly what this was: escalation. The next morning, Caleb got to work. He replaced the mailbox, reinforced the base, and installed a heavy-duty steel plate behind it, something no baseball bat would break without a fight. Then he walked the perimeter of his property, making mental notes of blind spots and access points. He wasn't just fixing a mailbox. He was fortifying his home. Inside, Caleb set up an old laptop he hadn't touched in years, hooking it up to a couple of small cameras he installed discreetly around the yard. They weren't high-tech by any means, but they'd do the job. He also dug out a journal, flipping to a fresh page where he began listing details: the make and model of the truck, the direction it sped off in, and the time of each incident. This wasn't just preparation. It was a plan. That evening, Caleb sat on the porch again, Bailey at his feet. He kept the porch light off, letting the darkness cloak him as he waited. Hours passed, the neighborhood falling silent. But Caleb didn't mind the wait. Patience was second nature to him. Then, just past midnight, the low rumble of an engine broke the quiet. He saw headlights in the distance, creeping down the street with their brightness dimmed. The truck slowed as it approached his house. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The truck stopped briefly, and someone leaned out the passenger window. Caleb heard the distinct thunk of a glass bottle shattering against his driveway. They were brazen, confident in the cover of darkness. But they didn't realize they'd just given themselves away. He stayed motionless, memorizing every detail. The deep growl of the truck's engine, the faces partially illuminated by the dashboard light, and the faint logo on the driver's side door. Caleb didn't chase after them. He didn't yell or react. He let them think they'd won. The next morning he pulled up the footage from his cameras and froze the frame on a clear shot of the truck's license plate. A quick search confirmed what he already suspected. The truck belonged to one of the men who'd been hanging outside the gas station the other night. Caleb stared at the screen, his jaw tight. These weren't kids pulling pranks. They were organized, emboldened by each act of aggression. They thought he was alone, an easy target. But Caleb had spent his life studying enemies like this. He'd trained to dismantle entire networks, to think 10 steps ahead. He knew exactly how to deal with people like them. And now, Caleb wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to make sure they couldn't do this to anyone else. Caleb leaned back in his chair, staring at the laptop screen. He'd seen men like this before, arrogant, overconfident, thinking they were untouchable. But he also knew their kind shared one fatal flaw. They always underestimated the wrong man. He spent the next few days gathering more details. He drove by the gas station where the group often hung out, parking just far enough away to avoid notice. He observed their movements, noting the times they came and went. It didn't take long to identify the ringleader, a stocky man with a scruffy beard and a loud voice. He seemed to thrive on attention, constantly cracking jokes that made the others laugh. Caleb also noticed something else, a logo on the back of their jackets that matched the one on the truck. It belonged to a local auto repair shop. A quick search online confirmed the shop was owned by the ringleader's uncle, which explained the free rein these men seemed to have in the area. Caleb wasn't interested in confrontation, not yet. He wasn't the kind to throw punches unless absolutely necessary. Instead, he started with their weak points. The first step was subtle. Caleb sent an anonymous tip to the State Department of Transportation, flagging the shop for improper vehicle inspections. Within a week, inspectors arrived, shutting the place down for violations. The gang's favorite hangout spot disappeared overnight. Next, Caleb went to the police, but not to report the incidents directly. Instead, he framed it as a concern for the neighborhood. He mentioned seeing trucks speeding down residential streets late at night, vandalism increasing, and suspicious activity around certain properties. He kept the details vague but specific enough to draw attention. It worked. Patrol cars started driving through the area more often, their presence unsettling the gang. Caleb noticed them scattering whenever a cruiser came by, their bravado fading. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. Caleb printed out the clearest images of their faces from his surveillance footage, along with the license plate number of the truck. He mailed them anonymously to the gang's employer, the uncle who owned the shop. Along with the photos, he included a brief, typed note. "Your boys have been busy terrorizing a neighbor. You might want to take care of this before someone else does." The effect was immediate. A few days later, Caleb saw the ringleader and two of his friends arguing loudly outside the shop. The uncle, red-faced and gesturing wildly, threw something at them, a set of keys Caleb guessed, and stormed back inside. The gang's truck disappeared for a while after that. But Caleb wasn't done. He wanted them to understand the weight of their actions. He wanted them to feel the fear they'd tried to instill in him. Late one night, Caleb parked his car near the ringleader's house. He'd learned the layout well over the past few weeks. He left a small note pinned to the driver's side door of their newly repaired truck. It read, "I see you, I know you, and I'm not going anywhere." The next day, the ringleader was at the gas station, pacing nervously. Caleb watched from a distance, satisfied. They weren't laughing anymore. Caleb had turned the tables without throwing a single punch, and now it was only a matter of time before their own paranoia finished the job. A week passed, and the once loud, brazen gang was nowhere to be seen. Their truck sat parked in front of the repair shop, untouched, while the gas station had returned to being just another quiet stop for locals. Caleb watched from his porch, sipping his morning coffee as Bailey lay lazily at his feet. But Caleb wasn't the type to let his guard down completely. He'd lived long enough to know that people like this didn't change overnight. Still, he'd seen the fear in their eyes, the hesitation in their movements. They weren't as bold as they used to be, and that was enough, for now. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Caleb was outside trimming the hedges when he saw a car slowly pull up to his driveway. He recognized the man who stepped out immediately, the ringleader. Caleb straightened, his grip tightening on the shears, ready for whatever was about to come next. The man didn't approach aggressively. Instead, he kept his hands visible, his steps tentative. Caleb said nothing, letting the silence hang heavy between them until the man finally spoke. "I didn't come here to start trouble," he said, his voice quieter than Caleb expected. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Caleb raised an eyebrow, skeptical. The man shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, glancing down at his boots. "What we did, It wasn't right, the man continued. I don't know what I was thinking. I guess we thought we could get away with it. But you proved us wrong. You showed us you're not someone to mess with. Caleb let the words hang in the air, weighing their sincerity. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but firm. You didn't just come after me, Caleb said. You came after my home, my peace. You thought you could scare me into running, but you didn't stop to think about the harm you were doing. Not just to me, but to this whole community. The man nodded, swallowing hard. I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I had to say it. For a moment, Caleb considered his options. He could send the man away, let him carry the weight of his guilt on his own. Or he could do something harder, something that required more strength than any fight he'd ever been in. You've got a lot to make up for, Caleb said finally. But it starts with this. Owning what you did. Fixing what you broke. If you're serious about being better, you've got work to do. The man looked up, surprise flashing across his face. He nodded again, this time with more conviction. I'll do whatever it takes, he said. Caleb watched as he turned and walked back to his car, driving off into the night. He didn't know if the man's apology would lead to real change, but he knew he'd planted a seed. As Caleb stood on his porch, the sun setting behind him, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. The battle wasn't just about defending his home, it was about standing up for what was right, about showing strength without losing his humanity. And that's the lesson Caleb wanted everyone to take away. Strength isn't about fists or fear. It's about resilience, integrity, and the courage to choose justice over revenge. To those watching, the message is clear. When faced with hate, you have the power to respond in a way that inspires change. Stand firm, hold your ground, and be the light that pushes back against the darkness. If you've ever felt like the odds were stacked against you, remember Caleb's story. It's not about how many battles you've fought. It's about how you stand when it matters most. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more inspiring stories of strength, resilience, and justice. Together, we can create a space where courage and kindness always prevail.